on Thursday for our usual Facebook Live. Thank you for your patience. If you tried to tune in at 12:30, we had something come up here in my community. We actually had a small fire in one of our buildings, so that was a little distracting this morning, and so I'm a little bit late getting rolling today. But welcome to this week's Facebook Live, and I'm going to be focusing today on domestic violence and police violence in Wyoming. And before, though, I want to do just a quick COVID-19 update for all of you. So here in Wyoming, we are up to 230 confirmed cases, and of course there's many more suspected cases floating around. There continue to be a lot of good mutual aid actions that are happening around the state, and as usual you can check out, there's a pinned post at the top of our Facebook page that will continue to be our pinned post for a while until we feel like we no longer need it, that has a bunch of resources in it for folks around COVID-19. I also just want to say how really deeply sorry I am for people who have already lost someone in this thing. I have a lot of friends actually who have lost family members or close friends already. It's one of the downsides of me knowing people all over the country, is that I know a lot of people and have a lot of connections in with folks, and the mourning is being really hard for a lot of people. This was not something that we could have even pictured a couple months ago, and I think that folks are really struggling with it, and also struggling with isolation, struggling with having a lot more your kids at home all the time, and having to figure out how to be sort of teacher and parent simultaneously. And I think all of us just being kind of in close quarters together has been stressful for a lot of folks. And then there's the extroverts who are having to be in isolation, and so just recognizing there's a lot of stress for people right now with COVID-19. If you have not yet seen the petition to governors to try to get rent, utilities, and mortgages paid for the next 2 months, and also to have people not have to lose their housing right now, I'll go ahead and put a link to that in the chat again, and give people a chance to sign on to that petition. So I decided to focus this week on violence in part because of COVID-19. Domestic violence numbers are sharply up both worldwide and in the United States as people have been going into isolation. On top of whatever is usually happening in abusive dynamics, additional abuse is taking the form both of people not being able to get away from their abusers and the close quarters, increasing those stresses to the point that they can sometimes lead to incidents of violence and abuse. And also sometimes people dealing with threats of being thrown out of their homes if they start showing symptoms. So COVID-19 has definitely made our domestic violence crisis a lot worse. I know a lot of you are aware that my work, when I'm not on the campaign trail, has a lot been in cooperative culture development. And so I think a lot in terms of cultural patterns. And we happen to live in a culture and in a country that often reaches for violence as a problem-solving tool. And that problem might be anything from stress, which leads to violently lashing out at the people closest to us. That problem could be perceived differences threatening somebody's sense of security, and that often leads to racist and homophobic violence. It could be a government or a corporation that is trying to get access to increasingly rare resources, leading to military invasions and coups and assassinations of problem people who are trying to protect those same resources for their own people. It could be a police officer who is confronted with an unknown in a situation and leans into their training, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the mechanisms of all of these examples are really the same. Instead of working through our problems in a way that is mutually beneficial, de-escalating, even cooperative, violence tends to get picked up as the tool of choice in a lot of these situations. And it often happens very quickly, and it's not like people are thinking that through, but that's sort of what our cultural paradigm has pushed a lot of us to do. And we may label these kinds of violence differently. There's domestic violence, police violence, militarization of our relationship with actually most countries in the world. We see a good deal of racialized violence in our culture, including disturbingly high rates of murder, especially of trans women of color and indigenous women. And this week, Wyoming saw a new example of police violence. We've had yet another fatal police shooting, this time up in Platte County. And I wish this was unusual, but Wyoming is actually ranked 6th in the country for police violence. Now, when I helped to start ACOP, which stands for Albany County for Proper Policing, I learned a lot about police violence that I hadn't known before. We were started to create a community response to Robbie Ramirez's death at the hands of Albany County Sheriff's Deputy Derek Colling. One of the things that I learned is that law enforcement in Wyoming are actually not required to get any training in de-escalation. That means that many of our cops spend hours learning how to shoot and almost no time learning how to not shoot. There's also some scary connections between domestic violence and police. So I'm going to quote an article from KUTV out of Utah that I read earlier today. And so this opens up with a quote from the National Center for Women and Policing. And this is a quote. 2 studies have found that at least 40% of police officer families experience domestic violence, in contrast to 10% of families in the general population. A 3rd study of older and more experienced officers found a rate of 24%, which indicates that domestic violence is 2 to 4 times more common among police families than American families in general. And one of the complicating factors with this is what the article calls unique vulnerabilities when your abuser is also an officer of the law. So an officer who is abusing them knows the location of battered women's shelters, knows how to manipulate the system to avoid penalty, and knows how to shift blame onto the victim. And so police violence takes a lot of forms. It's both what is happening on the streets and also what is happening within their homes. So many people have questioned whether an officer, and now I'm no longer quoting from the article at this point, a lot of people have questioned whether an officer who is himself, and it is most frequently a man, a domestic abuser, is going to take serious abuse when it is brought to them in their line of work. This week, the Laramie Boomerang ran a story about a woman who is suing Albany County for the county's handling of her rape allegations. Trust is not very strong here in Albany County with our law enforcement system. My work with ACOP included being the lead facilitator for an open public forum last January on police violence in our county. And I'll drop a link in the chat to the report that came out of that meeting. That report includes a number of community-sourced pieces of potential focus areas that could end up eventually being legislative or pushing for reform in terms of our county's internal police procedures. Now, ACOP was never intending to focus on federal legislation, but the issues here in Wyoming are unfortunately not particularly unique. We may be high up on the per capita police shootings list, but every state has some of this stuff happening. I encourage everybody to read through that report, the content of which, again, came from community members here in Albany County. So some of the things that I'm pushing for in terms of police reform as part of my platform. So number 1 is zero tolerance policy on domestic violence among officers. Basically, if you're an abuser, you shouldn't be in uniform, period. This means the inclusion of police officers also in the one piece of gun regulation that I actually do support, which is that domestic abusers would lose their rights to own a gun. This is an important distinction because there is law in the books currently saying that you can't buy one if you actually have a conviction, but it doesn't say that you can't own or use one, and it doesn't say anything about patterned complaints about someone. And of course, being in law enforcement in the US comes with access to a gun. And this isn't true in all countries. Not all countries rely on guns as a main tool for law enforcement, but in the United States we do. This is also an important piece of legislation because over half of mass shooters are men with domestic violence histories. And 54% of these incidents actually involve a man shooting his domestic partner in the process of shooting a bunch of other people as well. So the second piece is democratically elected community oversight boards. Right now in Wyoming, the only people who police the police are other members of the law enforcement community. I'm pushing for federal level protections for every community to be able to have an oversight board if they choose to. States can currently block communities from creating this kind of board, and that's the case for communities in Wyoming, where we would need to have either state or federal reform in order to make it possible for us to have community oversight boards here. So, hospitals have boards, schools have boards. Why should law enforcement not also have some kind of community oversight to make sure that they are indeed protecting and serving? The next thing is mandatory de-escalation training, which is fairly straightforward. And what I would like to see is that the same amount of hours and resources are dedicated to nonviolent de-escalating responses to calls as are dedicated to firing your gun and using your taser and doing other things that are, bodily assaultive in some way. Fully funding Medicare for all that includes mental health care and strengthens our mental health services in every community so that cops are not the ones responding to mental health calls. This is actually a huge problem, is that, cops are not mental health practitioners, and they get called to a lot of things in a lot of our communities because our mental health sectors are underfunded and undersupported. And this was the situation that ended in the death of Robbie Ramirez. It's also an important piece because one of the talking points that often pops up when mass shootings happen is that folks with mental health challenges are to blame in some way. But there's actually no statistical data proving that. And in fact, if you have a mental health challenge, you are much more likely to end up being the victim of violence like Robbie was, rather than being a perpetrator. The next piece is a federal database of police shootings and deaths. So it turns out that Derek Colling, who killed Robbie Ramirez, has a track record of killings and other violence on the job. He is, in fact, one of the deadliest cops in the country. But there was actually no easy way for us to figure out that information. I believe that communities have the right to know how safe they actually are, and a federal database of every police shooting would allow us to understand far better than we currently do what our law enforcement is actually doing out there on our streets. Finally, I'd like to see us develop systems of community self-policing. So law enforcement in the U.S. actually has some pretty disturbing roots to it. The first organized police forces in the U.S. were actually created to bring in escaped slaves. And the relationship between the police and communities of color, as well as sexual minorities, is frankly pretty ugly in many places. There are many examples out there of communities policing themselves and creating systems, sort of like community watch systems, but also community intervention systems and de-escalation systems. And those communities tend to be far safer than ones that have professional police force only. So those are some of my thoughts on domestic and police violence. I appreciate you tuning in and watching today. This Sunday's virtual town hall on Zoom will be at 1 o'clock Mountain Time, and we will be focusing this week on Wyoming's dual epidemics of opioid addiction. Thanks so much for checking this out this week, and I'll see you all on Sunday.